The interwar period left Albania in a delicate and uncertain position within the European balance of power. Having declared independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1912, the country endured a turbulent series of political shifts, foreign occupations, and internal rivalries during and after the First World War. Its borders, formalized in 1913 by the Great Powers, left it with limited strategic depth, an underdeveloped economy, and a fragmented society composed of diverse regional and tribal affiliations. The new state was recognized internationally, but its political institutions remained fragile, its economy primarily agrarian, and its infrastructure rudimentary. By the early 1920s, Albania was a constitutional monarchy in name, but struggled to maintain central authority. Ahmed Zogu, a northern chieftain and skilled political operator, emerged as a dominant figure, serving as prime minister and later president. In 1928, Zogu crowned himself King Zog twice, establishing the Albanian kingdom. His reign sought to modernize the state through administrative reforms, limited industrial projects, and a centralization of power in Tirana. However, these efforts were constrained by scarce financial resources, dependence on foreign loans, and a minimal industrial base. Italy, under Benito Mussolini's fascist regime, had long considered Albania within its sphere of influence. Rome's strategic ambitions in the Adriatic Sea, coupled with its desire for a forward base in the Balkans, made Albania a natural target for political and economic penetration. Starting in the 1920s, Italian influence grew steadily through loans, trade agreements, and military aid. By the early 1930s, the Italian government controlled significant sectors of the Albanian economy, including infrastructure projects, mineral concessions, and banking institutions. The 1927 and 1931 defense pacts between Albania and Italy deepened this dependency. In exchange for military assistance and economic investment, King Zog allowed Italian officers to train the Royal Albanian Army and admitted Italian advisors into key ministries. While these agreements strengthened Albania's nominal defense capacity, they also gave Rome considerable leverage over Tirana's internal and external policy decisions. Despite Italian involvement, Zog attempted to maintain a degree of independence by balancing relations with other powers, including Yugoslavia and Greece. He curtailed the number of Italian advisors in the mid-1930s and sought alternative economic partners. However, such moves provoked Mussolini's irritation, leading Rome to apply political and economic pressure to reassert control. By the late 1930s, with Europe edging toward wider conflict, Albania's ability to resist Italian influence was diminishing rapidly. In 1938, Mussolini ordered the preparation of a plan for the direct military occupation of Albania. The operation's strategic rationale was twofold. First, to preempt potential British or Yugoslav influence in the region, and second, to demonstrate Fascist Italy's military strength in the Balkans ahead of anticipated larger conflicts in Europe. Intelligence assessments in Rome concluded that Albania's armed forces, numbering around 15,000 troops with limited artillery, obsolete rifles, and virtually no air or naval capacity, could not mount a sustained defense. Public sentiment in Albania during this period was complex. Rural populations, which formed the majority, were more concerned with local economic hardship and clan affairs than foreign policy. In urban centers like Tirana, Shkodra, and Vlora, political elites debated the extent of Italian influence, but organized opposition to Rome's presence was weak and fragmented. Some segments of the officer corps resented Italian oversight, yet others viewed cooperation as the only realistic means of maintaining Albania's security. By early 1939, tensions were approaching a breaking point. Italy's recent conquest of Ethiopia in 1936 and its intervention in the Spanish Civil War had emboldened Mussolini, while Albania's isolation left it vulnerable. Zog's marriage in April 1938 to Hungarian Countess Geraldina Ponyi was celebrated domestically but did little to alter the strategic situation. Rome's demands for a military alliance on Italian terms intensified, and diplomatic correspondence grew increasingly confrontational. On the eve of the Second World War, Albania stood at a geopolitical crossroads. Internally, the monarchy faced economic stagnation, a limited military capacity, and political dependence on a foreign power. Externally, it was caught between the ambitions of fascist Italy and the uncertainties of the broader European security landscape. The stage was set for a rapid and decisive confrontation, one that would not only end King Zog's reign, but also set the country on a path toward decades of communist rule under Enver Hoxha. In the early hours of 7th April 1939, Italian naval convoys approached the Albanian coast under orders from Mussolini to execute the occupation plan in a single day. The Italian force consisted of approximately 22,000 troops, supported by 600 officers, transported aboard a fleet of more than 100 vessels, including destroyers, cruisers, and transport ships. Air support came from the Regia Aeronautica, which maintained reconnaissance and bomber units over key ports to deter any Albanian resistance or foreign interference. The landings were organized into multiple groups to secure principal coastal cities simultaneously. Durrës, Vlora, Saranda, and Shëngjin were identified as primary objectives. The most critical was Durrës, Albania's main port, located just 35 kilometers from the capital, Tirana. General Alfredo Guzzoni, commanding the operation, aimed for rapid seizure of these points to prevent organized defensive coordination. The Albanian Royal Army, under General Gustav von Mirdach, was mobilized but in a severely limited state. The entire army fielded fewer than 40 artillery pieces, most dating from the First World War, and no armored vehicles. Ammunition stocks were low, and training levels varied sharply between units. Mobilization orders were issued late in the night of 6th of April, leaving little time for defensive preparations. The garrison at Durrës, numbering roughly 360 soldiers and a small contingent of armed civilians, was reinforced by several officers but lacked heavy weapons. At dawn, Italian ships anchored offshore and issued demands for surrender. When these were refused, naval guns opened fire, targeting positions near the port and railway lines. Italian Marines of the San Marco Battalion and Bersaglieri units began landing under covering fire. The defenders, positioned in sandbagged emplacements and buildings overlooking the waterfront, returned fire with rifles and light machine guns. For several hours, exchanges took place at close range, and the Albanians destroyed a few landing craft with concentrated fire from small-caliber artillery. Elsewhere along the coast, resistance was more sporadic. At Vlora and Saranda, smaller garrisons offered brief resistance before being overrun by larger Italian forces. The Albanian Navy, consisting of only a handful of patrol boats, was unable to engage effectively and withdrew toward minor inlets or scuttled vessels to avoid capture. Communication between defensive positions was hampered by the rapidity of the landings and the limited availability of radios. In Tirana, King Zog convened his ministers to assess the situation. Reports from the coast made clear that Italian troops were advancing inland faster than expected. Zog initially considered leading a resistance movement from the interior, but the lack of trained reserves, the risk of civilian casualties in urban centers, and the near-complete absence of international support forced a reassessment. By midday, Italian units had secured Durrës and begun moving along the main road toward the capital, encountering only isolated skirmishes. Italian propaganda broadcasts, transmitted from ships offshore and from mobile radio units, declared the operation a peaceful liberation and urged Albanians to accept union with Italy. Leaflets promised investment, jobs, and security under Italian administration. While some rural communities remained unaware of events for several days, urban populations witnessed the visible approach of Italian columns. By evening, the Italian army had secured all major ports and was positioned within striking distance of Tirana. The speed of the advance, combined with Albania's inability to mount a coordinated defense, meant that the monarchy faced an imminent collapse. The following day would determine whether King Zog's government could remain in the capital or be forced into exile, marking a decisive moment in the country's modern history. The Italian advance toward Tirana on 8th of April 1939 proceeded with minimal organized opposition, Motorized infantry and light tanks from the Littorio division moved inland from Durrës along the main highway, securing bridges and junctions as they advanced. Reconnaissance units pushed ahead to scout for defensive positions, but found only scattered detachments of Albanian troops and armed civilians, most of whom withdrew after brief exchanges of fire. The lack of heavy weapons, combined with poor coordination between units, made sustained resistance impossible. In the capital, King Zog and his ministers met repeatedly throughout the day in the royal palace. Foreign envoys, including representatives from the United Kingdom, France, and Yugoslavia, sent reports to their governments, but offered no concrete assistance. Italy had timed its operation to avoid provoking an immediate international response. With the world's attention fixed on the deteriorating situation in Central Europe, there was little appetite among the great powers to confront Mussolini over Albania. Zog's primary concern was the safety of his family and the royal treasury. By mid-afternoon, it was decided that remaining in Tirana would risk capture and possible coercion into accepting Italian demands under duress. Preparations were made for the royal entourage to leave the capital under armed escort. Gold reserves from the National Bank were loaded into vehicles alongside personal belongings, documents, and provisions for a long journey. The chosen route led eastward toward Elbasan and the border with Greece, avoiding main roads where Italian patrols might appear. Meanwhile, Italian forces consolidated their hold on key strategic points. Coastal artillery batteries were taken intact, providing Rome with immediate control over Albanian territorial waters. Airfields at Tirana and Vlora were occupied without significant damage, allowing the Regia Aeronautica to station fighter and reconnaissance units for regional operations. The Albanian gendarmerie, operating in various districts, faced a dilemma: resist and risk annihilation, or stand down to preserve local order under the new occupation authority. Many commanders opted for the latter, especially in areas where the Italian presence was already overwhelming. By the evening of 8th of April, Italian patrols entered the outskirts of Tirana. The city's population reacted in varied ways. Some residents watched cautiously from windows and balconies, while others gathered in public squares to observe the columns of soldiers, trucks, and armored cars rolling through the streets. The occupation was not accompanied by large-scale violence in the capital, but the sudden change of authority created uncertainty. Government offices were either deserted or taken over by Italian officers who arrived with prepared lists of administrative replacements. On the morning of 9th of April, King Zog crossed into Greece with Queen Geraldine, their newborn son, Leka, and a small retinue. The escape marked the effective end of Albania's monarchy as a functioning political authority. Italian troops entered the center of Tirana soon after, raising their flag over public buildings and announcing the establishment of a provisional administration under Italian oversight. The occupation was presented in official communiques as a union of the two nations under the crown of King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy. From the Italian perspective, the operation had achieved its objectives in under 48 hours. The rapid occupation minimized casualties. Italian losses numbered fewer than 30 killed, while Albanian fatalities, including both soldiers and civilians, were estimated at a few hundred. The absence of prolonged fighting reduced infrastructure damage, allowing the occupation authorities to move quickly in asserting control. Military police units were deployed to maintain order, while engineers began improving roads, ports, and airfields to integrate them into Italy's broader strategic network in the Adriatic. For many Albanians, the sudden transition was disorienting. Those employed in the civil service, armed forces, or urban industries faced immediate questions about their roles under the new regime. Rural communities, especially in the mountainous north, experienced little direct contact with the occupiers in the first weeks. But word of the invasion spread quickly, often accompanied by rumors of further expansion by Italy into neighboring territories. In both urban and rural areas, a sense of uncertainty prevailed, not yet resistance, but an awareness that the old order had ended and that a new political reality was taking shape under foreign control. The consolidation of Italian authority in Albania after 9 of April 1939 followed a carefully structured plan developed by Rome's military and political leadership. The initial phase involved the establishment of a civil administration directly subordinate to Italian ministries, bypassing what remained of the Albanian governmental apparatus. Shefkat Verlaci, a prominent landowner and political rival of King Zog, was installed as prime minister under the Italian governor Francesco Giacomoni. This arrangement provided the occupation with a local facade while ensuring that ultimate authority remained in Italian hands. The Royal Albanian Army was formally dissolved within days of the occupation, and surviving units were reorganized into auxiliary formations under Italian command. Officers who had served under Zog were presented with a choice: swear loyalty to King Victor Emmanuel III or resign. While some accepted in order to retain their positions and incomes, many others withdrew from public life, returning to private occupations or seeking refuge in rural areas beyond the immediate reach of the new regime. In the capital, Italian forces transformed key buildings into command centers, barracks, and logistical depots. The royal palace became the residence of the Italian governor, while the main ministries were reorganized along Italian administrative lines. Military police patrolled streets and maintained checkpoints on major roads leading into Tirana, controlling movement and monitoring potential sources of dissent. Economic measures were introduced to align Albania's economy with that of Italy. The Albanian lek was pegged to the Italian lira, and trade policies were rewritten to prioritize exports of raw materials, particularly oil, chromium, and bitumen, to Italy. Infrastructure projects, including the expansion of the port at Dure and improvements to the road network, were presented as modernization initiatives but primarily served Italian military logistics. Italian engineers and construction companies were brought in to carry out the work, often sidelining local contractors. In the countryside, the impact of the occupation varied widely. In lowland agricultural regions, Italian authorities sought to secure food supplies by purchasing grain and livestock at fixed prices. In some cases, this created short-term economic stability for farmers, but it also tied rural production to Italian military needs, leaving less for local markets. In the mountainous north, where clan-based social structures persisted, the reach of Italian administration was weaker. Many local leaders accepted Italian authority nominally, while continuing to operate autonomously, maintaining traditional codes of governance and dispute resolution. Education and cultural policy were also reshaped. Italian became a compulsory subject in schools, and cultural exchanges were promoted to foster the image of a unified Italian-Albanian identity. Propaganda efforts portrayed the occupation as a historic reunion of two peoples connected since the Roman era. State-controlled newspapers and radio broadcasts emphasized economic development, infrastructure progress, and the benefits of integration into the Italian Empire. However, such messaging often met with skepticism, especially among those who viewed the loss of sovereignty as an unacceptable compromise. The early months of the occupation were marked by relative calm, but underlying tensions were evident. Small-scale acts of defiance began to occur. Distribution of anti-Italian leaflets, refusal to comply with new regulations, and occasional sabotage of infrastructure. Italian security forces responded with arrests, interrogations, and increased surveillance, particularly in urban areas and along transportation routes. Internationally, the occupation was met with formal protests from Britain and France, but these were limited to diplomatic condemnation. The League of Nations received Albanian appeals for assistance, yet no collective action followed. Mussolini's swift and unopposed success in Albania was perceived abroad as an indication of both Italy's growing ambition and the unwillingness of other powers to challenge it directly in the months before the outbreak of wider war. By the end of 1939, Albania was firmly integrated into Italy's strategic system in the Adriatic. Military garrisons were stationed in all major cities. Coastal defenses were reinforced, and the country served as a staging ground for potential operations into the Balkans. While the occupation had been achieved with minimal fighting, the loss of sovereignty and the reshaping of Albania's political and economic structures laid the groundwork for discontent that would later fuel organized resistance movements. Beneath the surface calm, a network of political exiles, former officers, and dissatisfied civilians was beginning to form. a development that would grow in significance as the Second World War progressed and Italy's position in the Balkans evolved. By early 1940, the Italian occupation of Albania had entered a phase of deeper integration into Mussolini's imperial system. The country was officially proclaimed in personal union with the Kingdom of Italy, with King Victor Emmanuel III holding the title of King of Albania. Italian governors, military commanders, and administrators directed all state functions, while Albanian ministers served primarily in ceremonial or advisory roles. Decision-making on policy, security, and foreign affairs was concentrated in Rome, with Tirana functioning as a provincial capital rather than an independent seat of power. The military presence remained substantial. Approximately 3,000 Italian troops were stationed in Albania, supported by artillery units, mechanized infantry, and coastal defense installations. Airfields at Tirana, Durrës, and Vlora were upgraded to accommodate bomber and fighter squadrons, enhancing Italy's ability to project power into the Balkans and across the Adriatic. Naval facilities were similarly expanded, allowing for faster deployment of Italian vessels toward the Ionian Sea. While the occupation had begun with minimal armed resistance, by mid-1940, isolated opposition groups were becoming more active. Many of these consisted of former Albanian officers, nationalist intellectuals, and local leaders unwilling to accept permanent foreign control. Some maintained contacts with exile communities in Greece, Turkey, and Western Europe, exchanging information and coordinating propaganda efforts. However, the scale of their operations remained limited, partly due to the extensive surveillance conducted by the Italian Carabinieri and OVRA, the fascist secret police. The Italian administration continued to reshape Albania's economy to suit strategic needs. Investment focused on sectors that could supply raw materials for the war effort. Oil fields near Kuchova, chromium mines in Bulkiza, and bitumen deposits in Salonika were all placed under Italian management. Labor recruitment was stepped up, with Albanian workers employed both locally and in Italy. While wages were offered, working conditions often reflected wartime priorities rather than civilian welfare. Culturally, the Italianization campaign intensified. Street names, public buildings, and official ceremonies were altered to emphasize ties with Rome. Italian became the primary language of administration and higher education, while Albanian language publications faced censorship if their content was deemed contrary to occupation policy. Italian settlers, administrators, technicians, and military families arrived in growing numbers, especially in urban centers. The aim was not only to run the occupation, but to create a visible and permanent Italian presence. Events beyond Albania's borders soon altered the strategic landscape. In June 1940, Italy entered the Second World War on the side of Germany, expanding the conflict into the Mediterranean and North Africa. Albania's geographic position made it a forward base for operations against Greece and a potential launch point for wider Balkan campaigns. Military traffic through Albanian ports increased sharply, and construction crews worked to improve supply lines toward the southern frontier. In October 1940, Italian forces in Albania were ordered to invade Greece. This operation placed Albania directly on the front line of a major campaign. Italian divisions crossed the border from staging areas in Korça, Gjirokastër, and other southern sectors. The offensive initially aimed for rapid penetration into Greek territory, but encountered determined resistance. Harsh mountain terrain, poor weather, and logistical challenges slowed progress. Within weeks, the Greek army counterattacked, driving Italian forces back across the border and capturing significant parts of southern Albania, including the strategic town of Gjirokastër. The Greek occupation of these areas presented a new dynamic. While some local populations welcomed the Greek advance as liberation from Italian control, others viewed it as a new form of foreign occupation. The conflict caused widespread displacement as civilians fled combat zones, seeking shelter in central and northern Albania. Food shortages, requisitioning of livestock, and the destruction of transport routes added to the strain on the civilian population. By early 1941, the war in Albania had become part of a wider regional struggle. The arrival of German forces in the Balkans in April 1941 reversed the Greek gains, restoring Italian control over all Albanian territory. However, the months of warfare had exposed both the vulnerability of Italian military planning and the fragility of its grip on the country. The Albanian population had now experienced two foreign armies operating on their soil within a short span, deepening the sense of instability and prompting growing interest in organized resistance. In the aftermath of the Greek campaign, Italian authorities tightened security measures, increasing arrests of suspected dissidents and expanding intelligence networks. At the same time, they sought to rebuild damaged infrastructure and restore economic output, aware that Albania's value to the war effort depended on stability. Yet beneath these efforts, nationalist movements, fragmented but slowly gaining coherence, were beginning to consider coordinated action. This simmering opposition would become a decisive factor in the years that followed, as the war in the Balkans took on a more complex, multi-front character. The defeat of Italian forces in the opening months of the Greco-Italian War and the subsequent German intervention in April 1941 altered the strategic situation in Albania, but did not resolve the underlying instability of the occupation. German troops entered the Balkans primarily to secure their southern flank before launching Operation Barbarossa, and their rapid victory over Greece allowed Italy to reassert full control over Albania. By late April 1941, all territory lost during the Greek counteroffensive was back under Italian administration, and military garrisons were reinforced to prevent a recurrence of such setbacks. The restoration of Italian authority came with significant changes. The Albanian borders were expanded under Axis arrangements, incorporating Kosovo, parts of Western Macedonia, and areas of Montenegro into what the occupation termed Greater Albania. These annexations were designed to strengthen local support for the regime by appealing to nationalist sentiment. However, the new territories also brought demographic and political challenges, as they contained diverse populations with differing loyalties and experiences under previous administrations. Italian authorities sought to co-opt influential local leaders, offering them administrative posts and material benefits in exchange for cooperation. The wartime economy in Albania shifted further toward resource extraction and military supply. Mining operations expanded, particularly in the newly annexed areas, where mineral resources were abundant. Transportation infrastructure was upgraded to facilitate movement of raw materials to Italian ports, with roads and rail links receiving priority over civilian needs. Agricultural production was directed increasingly toward feeding the Italian military presence, leading to rationing in urban centers. While some rural areas benefited from higher demand for their products, others suffered from over-requisitioning, creating shortages and resentment. Security policy grew more aggressive. Italian counterintelligence services expanded their network of informants, monitoring political activity, religious institutions, and suspected nationalist circles. Public gatherings required official permits, and censorship intensified. Arrests and internments of political dissidents, former royalist officers, and suspected communist sympathizers became more frequent. Nevertheless, these measures failed to eliminate clandestine activity. The growing influence of communist ideology in the Balkans began to reach Albania during this period. Exiled Albanian students and activists in the Soviet Union and elsewhere maintained contact with emerging local cells. Small groups in Shkodra, Korça, and Tirana began distributing anti-fascist literature and calling for armed resistance. The defeat of Italy and Greece had weakened the image of invincibility that Rome had tried to project, giving credibility to the idea that Axis forces could be challenged. By late 1941, the situation in the countryside was becoming more volatile. Isolated partisan bands began to form in mountainous areas, drawing on local networks of kinship and loyalty. These groups were initially small, poorly armed, and focused on survival rather than large-scale combat. However, they benefited from the difficult terrain, which limited Italian mobility and made complete suppression costly. In some regions, partisan activities aligned with those of Yugoslav resistance forces operating across the border, creating the first instances of cross-border coordination against Axis positions. Italian responses to these developments combined military sweeps with attempts at political accommodation. In some districts, they recruited local militia units to patrol roads and guard strategic sites, offering them autonomy in exchange for loyalty. In others, they applied collective punishment measures, including fines, property confiscations, and temporary detention of community leaders suspected of aiding resistance fighters. These tactics produced mixed results. While they secured temporary calm in certain areas, they also deepened hostility in others. The broader war in the Mediterranean and Eastern Europe was influencing events in Albania as well. Italy's military setbacks in North Africa, combined with the demands of the Eastern Front on Germany, placed strain on Axis logistics. While Albania remained a secondary theater compared to these fronts, its role as a staging area for operations in the Balkans and as a source of raw materials kept it under close strategic watch. As 1942 began, the Italian regime in Albania appeared outwardly stable, but its authority rested on a fragile foundation. The incorporation of new territories had increased its geographic reach, but also stretched its administrative capacity. Resistance movements were still in their formative stages, but they were growing in number, organization, and political clarity. The emergence of figures like Enver Hoxha within the communist faction and the parallel development of nationalist networks signaled that Albania was entering a new phase of occupation politics, one in which the contest for the country's future would increasingly be fought not only between occupiers and locals, but among Albanians themselves. During 1942, the political and military landscape in Albania shifted toward open confrontation between Italian occupation forces and emerging resistance movements. The communist network, still relatively small in the previous year, began consolidating into a more structured organization. On 8 November 1941, representatives from several local communist groups convened in Tirana to establish the Albanian Communist Party, later known as the Party of Labor of Albania. Enver Hoxha, a former schoolteacher from Gjirokastër, emerged as one of its key organizers, alongside other prominent activists such as Kemal Stafa and Koco Tashko. The party adopted a strategy of armed struggle against the occupation, political mobilization among workers and peasants, and coordination with other Balkan resistance movements. Parallel to the communist initiative, nationalist forces were also beginning to take shape. The Bali Kombëtar, National Front, was formed in late 1942, primarily composed of anti-communist intellectuals, landowners, and former army officers. While both the communists and the Bali Kombëtar opposed Italian rule, their ideological differences, particularly over the post-war political system, created underlying tensions. The communists advocated for a socialist transformation aligned with broader anti-fascist movements, while the Bali Kombëtar promoted the vision of an ethnically unified, independent Albania under a republican or nationalist framework. The Italian administration recognized the growing unrest and intensified its security operations. Large-scale sweeps were launched in central and southern Albania, targeting areas suspected of harboring partisans. Units of the Carabinieri, Black Shirts, and regular army divisions conducted raids on villages, seized livestock and supplies, and detained suspected resistance sympathizers. In many cases, such measures provoked further hostility rather than compliance, driving more recruits into partisan ranks. By mid-1942, the partisans had increased their operational capabilities. They carried out sabotage missions against railway lines, bridges, and communication centers, disrupting Italian troop movements and supply chains. Attacks on isolated garrisons and patrols grew more frequent, forcing Italian forces to divert manpower from strategic projects to security duties. The mountainous terrain provided the partisans with natural defensive advantages, allowing them to evade pursuit and strike where Italian presence was weakest. Civilian life during this period was marked by growing hardship. Wartime requisitioning reduced food availability, especially in urban centers, where rationing became stricter. Prices for basic goods rose sharply, and the black market expanded. Italian propaganda attempted to present the occupation as a stabilizing force, emphasizing infrastructure improvements and the promise of eventual autonomy under Italian guidance. However, the visible presence of armed patrols, checkpoints, and periodic arrests undermined these claims for much of the population. In an effort to counteract the appeal of the resistance, the Italians sought to cultivate loyalist militias drawn from certain local communities and clans with historical rivalries against others. While these units provided some support in guarding roads and supply depots, they also deepened divisions within Albanian society. The existence of multiple armed groups, Italian forces, communist partisans, nationalist fighters, and loyalist militias, created a complex and unstable security environment. International developments influenced the momentum of resistance activity. Allied advances in North Africa in late 1942 signaled that the Axis position in the Mediterranean was weakening. British intelligence, through the Special Operations Executive, SOE, began to explore opportunities for supporting Albanian resistance movements, although initial efforts were cautious due to the fragmented nature of the opposition. The Yugoslav partisans, already engaged in widespread operations against Axis forces, established contact with Albanian communists, providing them with advice on organization and guerrilla tactics. By the end of 1942, the balance of power within Albania had begun to shift. While Italian control over major cities and transport routes remained intact, large areas of the countryside were contested or effectively under partisan influence. The Communists and the Bali Kombëtar had not yet come into direct large-scale conflict with each other, but their separate command structures and competing political visions foreshadowed a struggle that would intensify once the occupiers were weakened. The Italian command understood that maintaining control in Albania would require a greater commitment of resources, yet the demands of other fronts, particularly in North Africa and on the Eastern Front, limited what could be allocated. This strain left garrisons more vulnerable and gave the resistance movements a growing sense that the occupiers' grip was weakening. The stage was set for 1943, a year that would see both the collapse of Italian authority and the decisive emergence of Enver Hoxha as the central figure in Albania's communist movement. The year 1943 marked a decisive escalation in Albania's wartime trajectory, as the combined effects of intensified resistance activity and the shifting fortunes of the Axis powers undermined Italian authority. Early in the year, both the Albanian Communist Party and the Bali Kombëtar expanded their forces, consolidating control over rural strongholds and challenging Italian positions with increasing frequency. The Communists, under Enver Hoxha's emerging leadership, emphasized political organization alongside military action, creating local councils, known as National Liberation Councils, to administer liberated areas and build a parallel governance structure. Partisan operations became more coordinated and ambitious. In southern Albania, units attacked Italian convoys on mountain roads, ambushed patrols, and seized weapons from poorly defended outposts. Bridges on key supply routes between Tirana, Vlora, and Gjirokastër were destroyed, forcing the Italians to divert engineering resources to constant repair work. By mid-1943, several regions, notably in Korça, Skrapar, and Diber, saw a near-continuous partisan presence, with Italian troops venturing into these zones only in force and often at significant risk. The Bali Kombëtar also increased its activity, focusing on nationalist recruitment and securing areas in central and southern Albania. In some districts, Bali Kombëtar fighters and communist partisans temporarily cooperated against Italian forces, coordinating attacks or dividing areas of operation to avoid unnecessary clashes. However, ideological differences persisted, and political negotiations between the two movements often broke down over post-war plans. Italian responses grew harsher as resistance spread. Large-scale counteroffensives were launched in the springs and summer of 1943, involving several infantry divisions supported by artillery and aircraft. Villages suspected of aiding partisans were burned, and inhabitants were detained or relocated. In some areas, Italian forces executed hostages in reprisal for partisan attacks, aiming to deter further resistance. These measures, while temporarily disrupting guerrilla activity, also deepened anti-Italian sentiment and increased recruitment into the resistance. The strategic situation for Italy deteriorated sharply after the Allied landings in Sicily in July 1943. With Axis defenses collapsing in the central Mediterranean, the Albanian theater became increasingly difficult to sustain. Supply routes from Italy faced disruption from Allied naval and air forces, and the prospect of an Allied landing on the Adriatic coast prompted Italian commanders to focus on defensive preparations rather than offensive operations. Morale among Italian troops in Albania declined, with desertions and surrenders becoming more common in isolated garrisons. On 8 September 1943, the Armistice of Cassabile between Italy and the Allies was publicly announced, marking Italy's formal surrender. The immediate impact in Albania was chaos. Italian units, suddenly without clear orders, faced the choice of surrendering to the Allies, resisting the advancing German forces, or negotiating with local resistance groups. Some garrisons handed over weapons to the partisans, while others attempted to hold positions until German reinforcements arrived. In several towns, armed clashes broke out between Italian troops and local fighters seeking to disarm them before the Germans could take control. The German response was swift and decisive. Wehrmacht units from neighboring Greece and Yugoslavia moved into Albania within days, seizing key ports, airfields, and communication centers. By mid-September, German forces had replaced Italian garrisons across the country, establishing a new occupation regime. The transition was accompanied by disarmament of remaining Italian troops, many of whom were taken prisoner and transported to camps in Germany or occupied territories. For the Albanian resistance, the Italian collapse was both an opportunity and a challenge. The sudden availability of abandoned weapons and equipment, rifles, machine guns, mortars, and ammunition, allowed partisan forces to strengthen their arsenals significantly. However, the arrival of German forces introduced a new and more formidable opponent. German occupation policy in Albania was characterized by greater efficiency, tighter control, and harsher reprisals against resistance activity. In the political arena, the fall of Italian authority intensified the rivalry between the Communists and the Bali Kombëtar. The Communists, benefiting from improved armaments and growing territorial control, moved quickly to consolidate influence through the expansion of national liberation councils. The Bali Kombëtar, while still committed to resisting occupation, sought to avoid direct confrontation with the Germans in order to focus on preventing a communist takeover. These diverging strategies would soon lead to open conflict between the two Albanian factions, even as both faced the shared challenge of German military dominance. By the close of 1943, Albania had undergone a rapid transformation, from a controlled Italian protectorate to a contested battleground between German occupation forces and increasingly well-armed resistance movements. The power struggle between nationalist and communist factions was becoming as decisive to the country's future as the broader war against the Axis, setting the stage for the final and most violent phase of the conflict. The German occupation of Albania, beginning in September 1943, brought a fundamental change in both military strategy and political dynamics. Unlike the Italians, the Germans did not attempt to integrate Albania into their state structure. Instead, they maintained a military occupation designed to secure supply routes, protect key resources, and suppress resistance. Control was exercised through a combination of direct military authority and the installation of a nominal Albanian government intended to project an image of sovereignty while remaining dependent on German support. In October 1943, a so-called Regency Council was formed, composed of representatives from various regions and political currents, but carefully selected to exclude figures aligned with the communist movement. The Germans allowed Albanian forces, largely drawn from former gendarmerie and militia units, to operate under nominal national command. These units were tasked with maintaining local order and combating partisans, but in practice, they often acted in coordination with German security forces, including the Wehrmacht, SS, and Feldgendarmerie. The communist partisans, now better armed after acquiring Italian stockpiles, intensified operations against the occupiers. Guerrilla actions targeted German convoys, rail lines, and isolated garrisons, particularly in mountainous areas where German mobility was limited. The National Liberation Army, the military wing of the communist movement, began to emerge as a unified fighting force under the command of Spiro Moisiu, with Enver Hoxha serving as political commissar. Recruitment expanded rapidly, drawing fighters from across the country, and by early 1944, the partisans could field thousands of men and women in coordinated operations. The Bali Kombëtar, though initially active in anti-German operations in some districts, increasingly shifted focus toward countering communist expansion. In certain regions, Bali units entered into tactical arrangements with German authorities, receiving arms and supplies in exchange for targeting communist forces. These arrangements were often pragmatic rather than ideological, rooted in the fear that a communist victory would mean the end of the nationalist political program. Nevertheless, such collaboration damaged the Bali's credibility among segments of the population and gave the communists a propaganda advantage. The German occupation relied heavily on punitive operations to deter resistance. Villages suspected of aiding partisans were subject to destruction, and civilians were frequently taken hostage to pressure fighters into surrendering. Notable reprisals occurred in Diber, Korça, and Pizza, where entire communities suffered executions or deportations following partisan attacks. These measures inflicted heavy losses on the resistance but also hardened local opposition, feeding the cycle of insurgency and retaliation. International developments again shaped the conflict. The Allies, recognizing the growing influence of the Albanian communists and their coordination with Yugoslav partisans, increased material and advisory support through the British Special Operations Executive. Weapons, radios, and training were supplied to select units, though British officers also attempted, with limited success, to mediate between the communists and the Bali Kombëtar to form a unified front against the Germans. The deep political divide between the factions, reinforced by their competing visions for Albania's future, prevented lasting cooperation. Throughout late 1943 and into 1944, the National Liberation Army launched larger-scale offensives, aiming to liberate entire districts. In some cases, they succeeded in holding territory for extended periods, establishing local administrations and redistributing land. These liberated zones served as both political showcases and logistical bases, allowing for recruitment, training, and the production of propaganda. German forces responded with concentrated offensives, deploying motorized infantry, artillery, and, when available, close air support to recapture contested areas. By mid-1944, the conflict in Albania had become a three-sided struggle. German occupation forces seeking to maintain control with limited manpower, communist partisans pushing for total liberation and political dominance, and nationalist forces attempting to balance anti-occupation activity with their opposition to communist ascendancy. Civilians, caught between these armed groups, faced constant displacement, requisitioning of supplies, and the risk of reprisals. The tide of the war in Europe was turning against the Axis. Soviet advances in Eastern Europe, Allied landings in Italy, and the collapse of German positions in the Balkans created pressure on German command to prepare for eventual withdrawal from Albania. The challenge for the Germans was to delay this retreat long enough to protect their forces in neighboring Greece and maintain a corridor for evacuation. For the Albanian resistance, this shift signaled that a decisive moment was approaching, one in which control over liberated territories and political legitimacy would determine the country's post-war trajectory. As summer 1944 approached, the partisans expanded their coordination with the Yugoslav movement, while the Bali Kombëtar faced declining influence in many regions. The balance of power was tilting toward the communists, setting the stage for the final battles against German occupation and the internal struggle that would decide Albania's future leadership. By the summer of 1944, the momentum in Albania had shifted decisively toward the communist-led National Liberation Army. German forces, though still capable of mounting punitive expeditions, were increasingly on the defensive as the broader Axis position in the Balkans deteriorated. The Wehrmacht's priority was no longer the suppression of the Albanian resistance, but the maintenance of secure withdrawal routes through Kosovo and Macedonia to safeguard its forces retreating from Greece. This strategic shift created openings for the partisans to expand their control over rural districts and to mount bolder attacks on urban centers. Enver Hoxha's leadership within the national liberation movement became more pronounced during this phase. Political commissars worked alongside military commanders to ensure that liberated areas followed a consistent political line, emphasizing land reform, the establishment of local councils, and the dismantling of pre-war power structures linked to landlords and collaborators. The movement's administrative network extended across much of the countryside, giving it a degree of legitimacy that neither the Germans nor the nationalist Bali Kombëtar could match. The Bali Kombëtar, weakened by earlier tactical cooperation with German forces in some regions, found its support base eroding. In areas where they attempted to resist the communists directly, they often faced simultaneous pressure from both partisans and German forces. In other districts, Bali units sought negotiated withdrawals, abandoning positions to avoid heavy casualties. While still present in parts of central and southern Albania, their capacity to influence the post-war political outcome diminished rapidly. Allied involvement increased in the final months of the occupation. British missions operating in coordination with Yugoslav partisans supplied the National Liberation Army with additional arms, ammunition, and medical supplies. These deliveries, combined with weapons captured from German depots and retreating units, enabled the partisans to launch sustained offensives. Key towns such as Berat, Korça, and Peshkopi were targeted in coordinated operations involving multiple partisan brigades, often preceded by the cutting of supply lines and the isolation of garrisons. German countermeasures remained aggressive when resources allowed. In August and September 1944, German units carried out operations in central Albania, using mobile columns and air reconnaissance to track partisan movements. Some successes were achieved in dispersing concentrations of fighters, but these operations could not reverse the strategic trend. Every German withdrawal left behind gaps quickly occupied by partisan forces, who consolidated their hold through both military presence and political organization. By October 1944, the collapse of German positions across the Balkans was accelerating. Soviet advances into Yugoslavia and the liberation of Belgrade cut off major lines of retreat, forcing the Germans to abandon much of Albania in a matter of weeks. Partisan forces moved rapidly to fill the vacuum, taking control of Tirana in mid-November after several days of street fighting that drove out the last German units. The liberation of Shkodra followed shortly thereafter, marking the end of organized German resistance in Albania. With the departure of the Germans, the internal struggle for power reached its conclusion. The Bali Kombëtar, already militarily weakened, was unable to mount a challenge to the communist-led movement. Many of its leaders fled abroad, while others were captured or executed in the months that followed. On 29 November 1944, the National Liberation Movement declared the full liberation of Albania, with Enver Hoxha assuming the role of Prime Minister of the Provisional Government. The immediate post-war period saw the consolidation of communist control. The new regime moved swiftly to dismantle remaining political opposition, reorganize the armed forces, and begin implementing policies aimed at transforming Albania into a socialist state. Land redistribution, nationalization of industry, and suppression of political dissent were introduced within months. The influence of the Soviet Union grew rapidly, shaping both domestic policies and foreign relations. For the Albanian population, the transition from monarchy to Italian occupation, then to German occupation, and finally to communist rule had taken place in just over 5 years. Each phase brought changes in governance, economic policy, and daily life. But the end result was a fundamental redefinition of the state's political identity. The monarchy of King Zog had been permanently dismantled, replaced by a centralized one-party system that would dominate Albania's political landscape for the next 4 decades. The wartime years left a complex legacy. The communist narrative celebrated the resistance as a unified liberation struggle, while alternative accounts emphasized the internal divisions, shifting alliances, and episodes of collaboration that characterized the conflict. For many Albanians, the experience of foreign occupation was inseparable from the civil conflict between rival political visions. The victory of Enver Hoxha's movement ensured that, for the foreseeable future, The official version of events would reflect the priorities and ideology of the new regime, an interpretation that would shape Albania's historical memory long after the war had ended.